There's a saying that says, when you repeat a lie too often, it becomes a truth. So while doing my usual research, I came across a video, and this video sparked my curiosity, which eventually led to this video as a kind of reaction. So in this video, a young man from Western countries, I think USA, he researched the country with the lowest life expectancy, and surprisingly, the result was Nigeria. So when I saw this video and I saw that the country with the lowest life expectancy was Nigeria, I was kind of surprised, because Nigeria doesn't seem to be the worst country in the world. So how would you tell me that Nigeria has the lowest life expectancy despite other countries having more problems than Nigeria? I know Nigeria is not perfect at the moment. Nigeria does has its own problems. But whenever I imagine these indices that claim to measure level of life expectancy by country, I tend to wonder, are these people truly measuring these indices of life expectancy objectively, or do they have a hidden agenda behind this? So it turns out that there are many factors that are considered when it comes to the calculation of life expectancy. So one of them includes the birth rate and the death rate. Now, in my years of studies as a sociologist, we did a lot of statistics, and one of them was calculating birth rate and death rate. And it's not just the birth rate and the usual death rate, we also calculate the infant mortality rate. For example, the rate at which infants die before they get to a specific age will be classified as infant mortality. But the major factor when it comes to life expectancy is age-specific death rates. So it's not just the infant mortality rate, it is rather a look at the rate at which people die, usually people between the youthful age and their mid-age. So I would guess that these guys who did this study and concluded Nigeria had the lowest life expectancy had seen a trend of people dying maybe between the ages of 30 and 50. So according to this study, the life expectancy for Nigerians is approximately somewhere around 50 years old. And this was quite shocking, because most people that die, whom I know, usually die youngest, except they die maybe taking drugs or doing some risky habits. But the average death age is, I would say, between 80 and 70. Many people live up to 90 years old, even 100 and more than that, especially in Western Nigeria, among the Yoruba. But I was kind of surprised, and I was skeptical about that result, because many people who are around the age of 50 were not dying around me. So what made Nigeria exactly the country with the lowest life expectancy? Let's dive deeper. So regardless of the age-specific death rates, another one is also the probability of dying. So probability of dying is not calculated randomly. Also, some factors are also put into consideration, and this factor would be listed out so that we can see if truly Nigeria has the lowest life expectancy in the whole world, or if this study, this conclusion, is just being biased and maybe has a hidden agenda. Now, number one, we have the socio-economic status. Now, under socio-economic status, we also look at stuff like income, GDP per capita, educational level, poverty rates, employment status, and social support. Now, all of these things combined together, yes, Nigeria in recent years have seen a decline in the GDP. But that doesn't necessarily mean that GDP equates to how long you're expected to live. Because sometimes I look at these Western countries and especially the United Nations, and they come up with very funny findings. They say, oh, this is the list of happy countries or the list of depressed countries. And in their own understanding, it seems they think that wealth equates happiness. But that's not always the case. For example, Japan is a wealthy nation, developed, and is among the first world nations. But regardless of its development and its wealth and its social amenities, Japan is still one of the most depressed nations in the whole world. Like, it's even more depressed than Madagascar. Madagascar, that is like poor and impoverished with poor infrastructure. They still have happier people compared to Japanese people. So that is a clear indication that your wealth does not equate your happiness. So most times they come up with countries like Finland, Denmark, and say, oh, these are the most happiest countries in the world. But results have shown time and again that these are not always the case. Besides, also regarding the socioeconomic status, sometimes we just look at the GDP, but GDP doesn't equate standard of living. So some countries, for example, has so much GDP. I will take even Nigeria, for example. So Nigeria, Lagos, particularly Lagos Island, so Victoria Island, Lekki, Elegushi, and maybe Ikoyi, Banana Island, and the environs of Lagos Island has a very high GDP. If it were to be calculated, like the income coming to these areas would be considered very high GDP. I think Lagos alone generates as much income as Kenya. That's just a country, an entire country. But despite the fact that Lagos has lots of revenue and all of that, except you're among the top 1% or the top 10%, I would say, you are most likely to suffer some hardship. For example, housing will be quite hard for you. Housing in Lagos is quite expensive, except if you live in a more remote area like Badagry and other places that are along the outskirts of the city. But regardless of that, we find that these places where we think has a higher GDP, sometimes it's harder for people who are middle class or lower class earners to survive in this kind of environment. But somewhere like, let me say, Plateau State or Jos, yes, it has its own wealth, but compared to Lagos, Jos has a lower level of income compared to Lagos. But in Jos, you find housing that are much more affordable. You find foods that are much more fresher. The environment is much cleaner, less pollution, and life there is much more relaxed and more family oriented. So the money doesn't always equate to longer lifespan or life expectancy. And that's just a comparison within Nigeria. So even if sometimes these studies might be carried out in just one region, but not the entire region of Nigeria, so people will just visit Lagos and maybe Ogun State and Abuja and conclude that's how the whole of Nigeria is. But Nigeria has many cities that are fairly normal and less polluted than these places. Now, another factor is behavioral and lifestyle. So this one pertains mostly to the diet pattern, sleeping habits, and your consumption of drugs, alcohol, narcotics, and all of that. So if you are one of those who take these substances, there's a chance that you can also lose your life before a certain age. So for example, people who are drug addicts have a tendency to suffer overdose of drugs. But compared to people who don't take drugs at all, they have a lower chance of dying due to drug-related issues. So in recent years, especially in Nigerian cities, I myself has witnessed this, especially among Nigerian youths and teenagers. There have been a high rate of drug use, particularly from young men who are in the university, because in this their stage of life, they are teenagers, they are youths, they want to test new things, they are under peer pressure, and that being said, they most times end up taking drugs, and this impact their health negatively. So you would not expect them to take drugs and still feel healthy and function properly, because these drugs destroy their body as time goes on. Now, this factor is also very, very important. Environment. For the environment, we see that Nigeria is heavily and densely populated compared to other African countries. And then in some Nigerian cities, especially Lagos to be specific, we have a problem of pollution due to especially our poor infrastructure, particularly electricity. Nigeria doesn't enjoy 24 hours electricity. We have electricity once a while for some hours in the day, and for maybe as long as 4, 5, or even 10 hours in some places, we might experience power cuts. So this factor has led to people investing more in generators, and generators in turn, they pollute the air. However, Nigeria is not the only country that suffers this kind of problem. Even Lebanon also in the past years have had issues of corruption worse than Nigeria, issues of embezzlement of funds, issues of poorly refined crude oil. And this poorly refined crude oil end up producing lots of smoke, and they pollute the air. And they have also the issue of electricity. But Lebanon is a smaller country compared to Nigeria, and even though they have this similarity with Nigerian case, it's not the exact same thing. So the comparison is not the exact kind of the same comparison. So while pollution through the use of generators is one of the case, we also have issues of waste disposal. Nigeria has not yet tapped into, yes, we are tapping into, but not immensely into the potentials of renewable energy. So for example, you could process your waste products into fuel that will be used to generate electricity, and you could also use it into maybe producing newer recycled stuff, maybe recycled plastic, recycled paper, recycled cardboard, recycled wood, recycled metal, and all the stuff. But we still have cases of land dump sites where people go and dump their waste, and this also would in turn affect the waterways and even the natural water bodies, the natural water table. And this can also affect the health, because everything we do is still connected to each other. Life is a cycle. So the water you drink is either coming from the ground or it's coming from the sky. And even the water coming from the sky doesn't just appear in the sky. It's also from the ground that is went up into the sky. So whatever we do, we are indirectly affecting ourselves, whether we know it or we do not know it. Now, for the health and healthcare, we have issues about the availability of drugs, also the availability of medical personnel. And in Nigeria in recent years, we have seen cases where most of our graduates in medical field are leaving the country rapidly because of low wages. So, however, Nigeria is not only the country with this kind of case, with this kind of issue. Even other countries like Lebanon and Egypt, where there's not so much investment in the medical sector. These people graduate from the School of Medicine with a degree in medical field, and they leave the country for greener pastures, usually the US, UK, Germany. So we have an issue where we are bringing up doctors, training them, and then exporting them to other countries, while our own country and our own people die due to shortages of medical personnel. So when it comes to health and healthcare, Nigeria, I would say, suffers from this. In the past, I would say in 1970s, 1980s, and down to the early 2000s, Nigeria health sector saw some improvements, particularly under the military regimes. But in recent years, our medical sector has suffered a lot. In the past, the general hospitals that were established by the government saw lots of investment. But in recent years, we have seen almost a neglect in this field, and most people prefer going to private hospitals instead of going to the government established ones, which are now plagued by corruption, which is not meant to be the case. And also cases of vaccination. Although I'll say this has been on the positive side, because previously in some regions of Nigeria, specifically in the northern part of Nigeria, there were cases where people opposed vaccination, they were anti-vax. And even in the south, some kind of religious bodies, like one of Nigeria's famous pastors, Pastor Chris Oyakilome, he is not really in support of medicines and vaccines. believes just pray and everything will be well. So these religious views, not just from Pastor Chris, even some Muslims in the north, they twist scripture and tell people not to take vaccines. And we saw cases where people had higher rates of polio. And even till today, you find lots of them that have polio or human papilloma virus, which is very, very dangerous. Can lead to cervical cancer, can lead to tumors in the leg, and to many other health-related ailments. But in recent years, we have seen a positive change in this. So people who were from the north of Nigeria were mostly brainwashed by some extreme religious ideologies are now opening up to the realities of the medical field and are bringing their children for vaccination at a higher rate compared to in the past. Now, another factor is demography. Now, in terms of demography, we also look at things like economically disadvantaged people when it comes to social discrimination and injustice, like in cases of places like Brazil or South Africa, where people of certain races or ethnicities are often neglected when it comes to certain implementation of policies. So, but in case of Nigeria, ethnicity has not really been a problem because, for example, some people think that, oh, the northern Nigeria is trying to maybe take all of the resources for itself. But if you observe well, southern Nigeria actually has lots of more investment and improvement when it comes to healthcare and education, and even in some cases infrastructure. But under Nigeria, yes, they have some big cities like Kano, Abuja, Jos Plateau, and maybe Taraba, places that are kind of developing. But regardless of that, they still have lots of rural communities that are heavily agrarian. But another factor to also consider when it comes to demography is also sex, gender. So for the sex aspect, women often are seen as having longer life expectancy compared to men for various factors, not because women have some supernatural abilities in them, but one of them is the fact that in most traditional societies, women very rarely take substances that harm their system, hard drugs and women also engage less in riskier sports. Men are more prone to be driven to actively participate in these kinds of activities that would endanger their life. Some of them might just want to prove that they are man enough to their friends and their peers, and in the process of proving this manly nature of theirs, they end up harming themselves and killing themselves in the process. So that's one of the factors. But also, I also want to bring some of these things to our notice, despite the fact that Nigeria is maybe not doing too well in some of this stuff like socioeconomics, behavioral and lifestyle, health and healthcare, environment and demography. But let's think about it this way. I'll list each of those factors and give the country with the poorest of these facilities. So number one, we had socioeconomic status. Now, the country with the poorest socioeconomic landscape or socioeconomic environment is South Sudan. Now, South Sudan just maybe they're the youngest country in the world, as is popularly said. They gained their independence roughly around 15 years ago, and they are still struggling with civil wars and poor infrastructure, regular flooding. Sometimes they have droughts, and all of these things combined, despite the fact that they are rich in natural resources, has also led to a poor socioeconomic status. And I'm wondering, why does South Sudan not have a low life expectancy compared to Nigeria? Like, why are they having a higher life expectancy compared to Nigeria? These guys fight civil wars regularly. I'm not saying that they deserve to go through all this pain, but yes, Nigeria has security issues, but so does the USA. The US have mass shootings and all of that, but yet Nigeria has lower life expectancy compared to South Sudan. Now, the second factor is behavioral and lifestyle, particularly smoking and risky lifestyle. And Bulgaria has the most unhealthy lifestyle behavior, very high smoking. And also we have Latvia, USA, and most of Eastern Europe. And I give an excuse that, oh, these countries, yes, they have problem with poor lifestyle patterns, but they still do better in maybe this or that and that. That can be an excuse that can pass, because maybe when you smoke, you can go to a doctor for some medical procedures to elongate your life. But regardless of that, some other countries also have issues of lifestyle, like South Africa. South Africa has issue of drug abuse in a very high rate, and they also have poorer infrastructure compared to, let me say, 10 years ago. I know it's a global problem. Many countries recently are having issues, many social problems. But let's not forget that Nigeria has its own problem, but it's not the poorest and the worst of all countries. My next factor here we have is health and healthcare system. Now, the country with the poorest healthcare system is the Central African Republic. Mind you, Central African Republic also have a very poor socio-economic status. Now, I'm also wondering, why does this country not have the poorest or the lowest life expectancy? Why is it Nigeria? Now, next year, we have environmental factors, that is pollution, poor living condition, population density, and all of that. And the countries with the poorest environmental factors or the poorest environmental living conditions are Chad, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Nepal. So Bangladesh, for example, it has issue of cross-country pollution, especially air and water pollution. So flow from India and Nepal, they combine into Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is destroyed. Bangladesh is banned by both India and Nepal. Now, the country also with the poorest demographic and social injustice is South Africa and Namibia, especially when you look at the issue of race in this context. Countries like this, South Africa and Namibia, had issue of Afrikaner dominated apartheid, and they had some problems like redistribution of land, where black people were forced to live in land that were very inhospitable to them, and has also contributed to many health issues till this day. So again, I ask this question: does Nigeria really deserve to be called the country with the lowest life expectancy, or is there some shady games going on in the background? Are they trying to demoralize the people of Nigeria? Because there's a saying that says, when you repeat a lie too often, it becomes a truth. Maybe that's what they're trying to insinuate here. Who knows? See you in my next video.